project methodology and knowledge areas. So we're now into chapter 3 of module 3. And this is when we're going to actually start diving into those 49 areas that you're going to need to know for the exam. But I'm going to give you a couple things of advice while we're doing this. That way you can get it all memorized, because it will make so much more, make your exam so much easier if you can get those down. So we have requirements versus technical uncertainty. You know, the more uncertain our things are, the more chaotic our projects are going to be. And you can see here, agile is in the high complex band. Incremental and iterative are in the moderately complex. Sometimes iterative can fall into high complex, but then we have definable, which is our predictive. That's low technical uncertainty and low requirements uncertainty. And of course, we got to talk about our product life cycle versus our project life cycle. So our project is limited, where the product might go on after our project. Our project stops when we close the project. It's handed over to operations. So when you see here, we have concept, design, development, and closure. That's the project life cycle. But once we go from closure, we hand it off to operations. And that continues that product life cycle. So it will stay in operations until a certain point, and then finally the product is just terminated. There's no more manufacture of it. There might just move into only offering repair parts and so on and so forth. But at that point, that's not our concern as a project manager. But our product life cycle, once we've handed it over to our operations, we might get the project back. Maybe we're creating a new product or modifying that product. So we have that introductory stage. We're creating that product. We might see, once it's out there in the market, we might have to resolve some quality issues with that project or product. So that might be a project we do. But then that product will sooner or later hit a maturity stage. A lot of people own it. Sales are high. We have a high volume of that's going out to the stores or whatnot. So our project might be to reduce production expenses. Trying to trim the fat on our production here. But then we have that decline. The product is being replaced by something else. Our product is seen as obsolete because there's something new. Or our product's been around so long that you just have the diehards that are still using the product, but most people probably moved on. So we could try to reinvent the product. There might be some products you use that were very popular many years ago, but now they're becoming popular again. Well, that's reinventing the product. That might have been a marketing project to try to do that. But we can do the product life cycle. This is what it looks like. There might be, once we hit maturity, we might try to create a version 2 of the product, and that might keep this scale going up. But we'd still have these 4 stages going on. So the framework of the process groups and knowledge area. This is probably going to be the most difficult part to know for the exam. So there's 49 processes in this chart. This chart, I believe, is on 3-31 and 3-35 of your book. So there's 5 process groups, which are across the top. So we have initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, and controlling, and then finally closing. But then there's 10 knowledge areas. So we'll go into both of these and further define them. But they're all based on inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs. You're going to need to know those. And depending on what the process is, you might have the same tools and techniques on all of them, or many of them, and the inputs might be similar, but the output could change. So the goal I would recommend is that you are able to write this out on your own from memory. I know that's going to be tough, but I recommend you learn to do that because that's going to help you on the exam. It's what I did for the exam. Once I sat down in the chair and the person said, "Do I have any questions?" and I said no, and they started walking away, I wrote this thing out. That way I had it written. I didn't have to try to remember all this, because when you're a couple hours into the test, you're going to feel like your brain is, mush. And therefore, having this already written is going to save you so much hassle. So when you look in that examination content outline, it's no longer organized by this, but the way this is organized will help you so much because of the groupings and the areas. You can just go to each one and see it. Okay, so what is a process? So I tell my students a process has an input, an operation, and an output. Here, PMI defines it as inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs. So the tools and techniques are essentially that mini operation you're doing to get that output. So the process, as it's defined here, is a set of interrelated actions and activities performed to achieve a specific result. You can probably think of your own company and think of a process. You need certain things, you do something with those things, and you get the output or the result that you need. Could be the input is somebody needs a report. The tools and techniques are you're gathering somebody needs a report, so that could be the overall process. The inputs are all the data. The tools and techniques might be your expert judgment in analyzing that data, and to your output could be a report that you're giving to the person who needed it. So these processes ensure the effective flow of a project through its life cycle. So by knowing these, it's really going to help your projects in the long run. And of course, it's input, tools and techniques, and then outputs. So the process groups. So the process groups are along the top of this chart. So we have initiating, planning, executing, monitoring and controlling, and then closing. So that's what we are set up to across the top, because those are our major groups of the project. We're going to go from initiating, we're going to move over to planning, and then we're going to move over to the execution. Monitoring and controlling is over all of it, really. But then we're going to move on to closing our project. So this chart is really going to be helpful. So definitely look at 3-31 in your book. So the processes, there's 49 of them. Don't let that get you down. It's a lot. It's a big number, but you're going to realize that there's like some key memory things you can do to remember which ones go where. So there's 2 relating to getting the project set up. The initiating, there's only 2 in that column. There's 24 in the planning phase. As you see, planning is the biggest one. That's done on purpose, because if you can plan really well in the beginning, everything else is easy. It's just take your time in the planning. So 10 related to doing the actual work, the execution. I mean, you guys have done project management before, so executing you should be good at. So 12 related to keeping the project in check, monitoring and controlling. So making sure our project is going in the direction we want it to. And then finally, there's only 1 in closing. We're concluding the project. We're closing down the project. There's only 1 process in there. So how do these processes fit together? The processes are actions. That's why they're at the top. You're initiating, you're planning, you're executing, monitoring and controlling, and closing. So that's all at the top. And then our knowledge areas are the knowledge you'll need. So these are things you need to understand. So we can classify our processes into competency areas. And I will say, out of these 49, you're probably going to use most of these areas. I would say you will not use all of them, but you'll use most of them. Depending on the complexity and how long your project is going on, it will probably dictate how much of the knowledge areas you're going to use. You will use all the process groups. All right. So the 10 knowledge areas. Integration. So we're going to begin with the end in mind. and get that project authorized. So we have to coordinate activities, control change, and close the project once we're done there. So that's going through all that the process groups, the initiating, planning, execution, monitoring, controlling, and closing. So we're going to hit all of those in the integration knowledge area. Scope. So we have to state what we'll be doing and what we will not be doing, and validate that that was the scope, that the scope got done. So the important thing is what you're not doing when it comes to scope. So schedule. Well, we need to know what activities we're going to do and in what order. This might be a water flow chart, a Gantt chart, whatever way you display this so everybody knows what's going on. And it will also, what resources? So you can plan for those resources to be available when you get to that spot on the schedule. So you want to make sure this is realistic and you can compare it to your baseline. Because if it's not realistic, you're probably going to go outside your schedule. Probably overshoot your schedule. Because most people tend to estimate low with schedules. I always try to schedule high. That way it looks like I'm doing better when I get the project done, early. It's always a good thing. But then it also gives you a little bit of wiggle room in case you need to extend a certain part of your project. Cost. We need to estimate what our activities and our resources are going to cost. This is going to help us develop the budget and measure and correct the variances. Because if we see that we're spending too much money in a certain activity, well, we probably need to look into that and see why we're spending so much money. Is there a problem that we need to address or something we didn't consider? Quality. Of course, we need to make sure we produce a quality product. So we have some metrics that we need to measure. We need to define in the audit process. How are we going to ensure that we're maintaining that quality? And then we need to make sure that we deliver that quality product to our customer. So 6, the resources. So we're on the 6th one down the list. We have to make sure that we plan our team. Our team is resources. So we need to acquire our team members, develop them if we need to make sure they have additional skills, and manage our team. And then release the team as we determine we don't need that resource anymore. And this goes for materials, this goes for equipment, whatever can be considered a resource. Needing a conference room, that's a resource. So, or a set of desks. Resources are not unlimited. You probably should release them so other people can use the resources when they need them. Communications. So how are we going to talk to the people that we need to talk to and ensure that the message that we want to give them is what they receive? So we need to make sure that the communication occurs between us, our stakeholders, our project sponsor, maybe the project champion, the executives of our company, whoever we need to talk to. We should have a plan on how to do that. So risk. So we need to identify and prioritize our risks. Some are going to be more severe than other risks. Let's say, it's snowing outside. Snow might be a moderate risk depending on where you live. If you're expecting a blizzard to come and drop a foot of snow, that might be a risk to getting a certain thing done because no one can get into the office. However, one way to mitigate that risk is maybe you guys go virtual for that time period. Whatever your plan is. So we have to determine the schedule and monetary impact and plan those resources and plan our resources and our responses to those risks. So if our project is going to happen over the summer, probably don't need to consider a blizzard coming. But if our project goes long and we start getting into winter months, that might be something now we need to consider snow. So we need to make sure that we monitor our risks. Now, procurement. We need to identify what we're going to need and what type, so we can start maybe working with our legal department on contracts or talking to the supply department about the contracts. Issue out request for bid or request for proposals or request for information. And then we need to control that process and close out those procurement contracts. Now, I'd recommend talking to your supply chain folks because they'll know exactly what needs to be done in this area. But you should have a general idea of what's going on here. Stakeholders. We need to identify all the stakeholders. Now, can we identify all of them? No. But we need to at least get the majority of them. And this list can add and decrease as we go on. But we want to see who can influence or be influenced by our project. If they can tell us what to do for our project or change how we do the project, they have influence. If our project is going to influence how other people do things, let's say in their job, well, we need to include them as stakeholders. And what kind of impact will they have on our project? Now, an executive probably has a bigger impact than the brand new person in the mailroom, but they have an impact on our project. And we have to manage their expectations and the engagement that we're going to have with them. Executives might only need a quarterly update, whereas a senior manager might need more updates. Let's say a monthly update. We got to figure out what our stakeholders need and give that to them. So that is our 10 knowledge areas. So these are the general categories, and then we have the process groups. But when we hit those intersections, that's when we actually have the processes that we need to work and understand for our exam. So our framework process map, here's a count of where everything goes. So initiating under integration management, there's only one that goes there. Or there's our first one. The second one is under stakeholder management. And then you can see there's a count all the way to 49 at closing and integration. So what I'd recommend is being able to write out this process map. Maybe write it in the morning, write it at lunch, write it at dinner, write it before you go to bed, where you can actually write out the full thing. Now, if you want to shorthand it, some parts, whatever works for you to understand what's on this process map. That way you can have the confidence in your exam. Now, you're also going to need to know some formulas when we get to that part of the book, and you can write down those formulas too. But for here, this is probably going to be more useful than some of those formulas that we'll learn later, because there'll be some questions that will be based on this. So let's see. That's where this brain dump comes in. So we need to understand this process map, because you can look at where we're at in the project. Because if the question is about managing and executing, well, we don't care about the other 4 process groups, right? So that could help narrow down the question. So, because most of the time, and it wasn't my experience, that will be asked for the sequence of a process. So what happens next type questions. And you can look at your process map and see what is the logical next step. So, and take a look at what activities reoccur in the project here. So, the brain dump that I've been mentioning about writing this all down, I would do that at the beginning of your exam. As soon as you sit down, they say, go ahead and start. Write this down. Write down some of the formulas that you've memorized, so you don't have to try to get through the mush in your brain, because this exam is a long exam. It's already written down, and you can just look at it. And that takes such a load off you, believe me. I did it. I did the whole write it down in the morning, breakfast, lunch, dinner, before bed. Probably did that for a week straight. That way I had it down pat. So with this process map, integration is the only area that has a process in each process group. So integration has initiating, planning, and all the other ones. I just drew a blank. So, but planning and monitoring and controlling process groups have processes in each knowledge area. So those columns, the controlling, planning, or I should say planning and monitoring and controlling, have all 10 knowledge areas. Initiation only has 2 processes. Closing only has 1. That's under integration. Scope, schedule, and cost have processes only in planning and monitoring and controlling. All others have something in executing. So, some little tricks that might be confusing right now, but once you start reading about these processes, it's going to make more sense because you'll be thinking along the way the book wants you to think. Don't rely on your personal experience. Go with the book knowledge because that will help you out. All right. So the ITTO, input, tools and techniques, and output model. So this is going to help you with all the processes. Every process has an input or multiple inputs. Tools and techniques, there's usually several of those, and 1 or 2, maybe 3 outputs. So inputs, what you need for your project. The tools and techniques are what you're going to use to do that operation in that process. End result is usually a document, a deliverable, or a decision. So all these processes are in the PMBOK guide, and they follow this model. So that way it's easier to see. Like, for example, expert judgment is in a lot of the tools and techniques on the processes. So it could be that you just put EJ or however you want to put it, expert judgment written out, and that way you know what that process needs. And it could be some other things in there too. So, and that's it for Module 3, Chapter 3. So if you have any questions, send me an email or ask me in class, and we'll get those answered for you. Hopefully, you can start seeing this process map and how we're expanding on that knowledge by explaining some of the processes as we move forward in our course. And that should reinforce that process map when you're writing it down, and so you can do your brain dump, but you have the knowledge behind each of the processes. So I look forward to seeing you guys in class, and you guys have a great weekend or a great evening, whatever time of day it is or day of the week. And like I said, shoot me an email if you have any questions. All right, you take it easy.